let her get here, and if there's any final tech stuff you need to do. I'm unmuted. And okay, so the people who are on the what's it called, the Zoom chat, can you hear us okay? Oh, Esther's on, good. Okay. Okay. Okay, yeah, you see your chat. It's a little bit of a stretch, but that's fine. We'll keep an eye on the chat. Can I ask those of you who have a clearer view, if something pops up, just wave and point. Okay. Okay, the panel is now complete, so welcome everyone. This is the panel on Worldcons outside North America. For reasons of various viral infections, I will be your stunt moderator while Stephen just preserves his voice in the corner, and when we say Australia, that's your cue to sort of do your best. So the idea here is that, you know, that there have been a significant number of Worldcons outside North America, and the way the bidding situation is going, there's quite potentially going to be a few more. This panel is not so much focused on the whys of that, but more kind of like some of the specific features of Worldcons outside North America. So for instance, for many, many years, you know, the going assumption was the American one would be the biggest, and then everybody else would be significantly smaller, and that seems to have changed recently. So that may be maybe a topic. Before we go into it, though, let me introduce or ask themselves to introduce themselves, our panelists, starting from the left. You know, say your name and what experience or what country you're representing.
Okay, my name is Jean-Louis Trudel. I'm from Canada, which is part of North America. However, and the last out of North America Worldcon I attended was in 1990. However, I was involved with the Canadian Worldcons of 94, 2003, 2009, and the 2009 Worldcon in Montreal, even though it was nominally in North America, was happening partly in French, and perhaps raised some of the same issues that Worldcons outside of North America raise. So I guess that's why I'm on this panel, because I don't really remember volunteering for it. But and of course, I'm also part of the bid for a French Worldcon in 2023, and kind of acting as a bit of a go-between. And maybe I'll say a bit more about that as we go on.
Hello, I'm Bastein Vergoni. I'm the bid chair of Nice 2023. My first Worldcon was the last one in Dublin, but in France I organized several events, a bit bigger than the Worldcon, but also different. So that could be interesting to discuss about some stuff.
Okay, I'm Vincent Docherty. I've been involved with a number of Worldcons. First one I attended was 1987 in Brighton, in England. And then I got involved in organizing them. I co-chaired the two Glasgow Worldcons, and I've provided contributions to various others, and I'll moderate the panel.
My name's Maree Pavletiech. I'm Vice Chair Experience for Con Zealand. First Worldcon I attended was 85 in Melbourne, and I've been variously attending some around. And I attended the 2014 one in London, and I think my first American Worldcon was Sasquan. So as far as I was concerned, attending Worldcons, the fact that they were all around the world was just part of the furniture. Although, you know, statistically they have been weighted in America. So yeah, basically we are doing this in Con Zealand because we don't know any better.
I'm Stephen Boucher. My first Worldcon was 1985, where I was actually staff on that one, and I've been board and division head on the remaining Australian Worldcons, and have been to pretty much, with possibly, I think, 3 exceptions every Worldcon since '85.
Okay, and a reminder that we're in the streaming room, so the audio is being shared with a group of people online who have, I believe, had a supporting membership in the convention as well. They can hear us, but they will just need to type in the chat box if they have any questions or comments for us, and we'll try and keep an eye on that. Yeah, I think. Let me see. Maree's mic was zooming in and out, so maybe you need to hold it a bit closer. Okay. So, Worldcons outside North America. I suspect most people in the room know quite a lot about the history of Worldcons. They started in 1939. They were held annually ever since then, apart from a couple of 3 years, I think, during the Second World War. The first, I think it was 9, were held in the US, and then it went to Canada. It went to the UK for the first time in the 1950s, 1953, if I recall. That kind of statistic was typical for, I think, for the 60s as well. So the majority were in the US, maybe occasionally one in Canada, one in the UK occasionally.
Yeah, the Heidelberg.
HiCon, the first was in Germany in 1970. It went back to the UK in 1987. 79 and 87. Yep. It went to The Hague, as somebody mentioned, in 1990. And by one of the strange quirks of the real world, my current apartment, if I hold my head out the window and look left, I can actually see the facility that was used in The Hague. And since then, I think pretty noticeably, the number of Worldcons outside North America has increased considerably. You know, we had in the 90s, apart from the Canadian ones in Winnipeg, we had Glasgow. I think it went back to Australia in, was it 99?
99.
Yeah. And then if we look at the list since then, there have been a significant number of, particularly non-US Worldcons. But, you know, if I start at 2000, so Chicago, then Philadelphia, San Jose, then Toronto, Boston, Glasgow, California, Yokohama in Japan, first Japanese Worldcon, Denver, then back to Canada, Montreal, then back to Melbourne, then the US for 3 years, Reno, Chicago, and San Antonio, then to London, then Spokane in the US, and Kansas City, and then to Helsinki. And then to Dublin this year, and Wellington next year. So the first case of a non-North American Worldcon handing over to another, if I remember correctly. And then Washington, DC in 21. In 22, there's only one formal bidder, that's Chicago. Then in 23, it gets very interesting because we have I'll do it in alphabetical order. So we have Chengdu in China, who are a couple of people waving in the room. Welcome. I like the pandas, by the way. Then, of course, Nice in France, who are represented here. And I believe Memphis is still active. I don't know if there's anybody here, but maybe we'll hear tomorrow.
Not in the room.
Yeah. Then 24, Glasgow is the only bidder so far. Whether that's Glasgow, UK or Glasgow, Scotland, then remains to be seen. And I can't remember who's going after that, but that's already far enough away. So in general, yeah, the majority of Worldcons are still held in North America, certainly, if we combine.
It's tended to be basically every 4 years.
Yeah.
On average, it's gone outside.
But there has been, I think, a little bit of an acceleration.
Yeah, it's tweaked up a bit, but it's still, you know, 2 to 1, but at least.
Yeah. And then the other thing that's quite noticeable, although I can't really show any graphs or anything that will be seen on the online. You know, Worldcons were pretty small up until I think it was at least the 50s or 60s. You know, a few hundred maximum. At some point, it reached about 1,000. I'm told, though I wasn't at it, it was the 1985 Worldcon in Kansas City. And that was Melbourne. Oh, 75, Big Mac.
76.
76. That one jumped up to several thousand. Pretty much we've stayed several thousand till then. It peaked in 84 with the LA Con, which was over 8,000 members, and a number we've only come back to in the last few years, and in London, for instance. And then basically between the 80s and up until a few years ago, most Worldcons, if they were in America, North America, they were probably not much less than 5,000 and could be as high as 7. The UK ones, so 79, 87, 95, 2005, they kind of leveled out at just a bit over 4,000, 4,500. The Australian ones were, what, 1,500 to 2,500 or something?
Yeah, about 1,800 warm bodies on site was about where it peaked. But like the first one was 600 people, then there was 1,400, then about 1,800.
Okay. And then in the this decade, things started going very strange. Partly that was due to external factors, where a group were involved in rigging the Hugos. That triggered a huge influx of supporting members in Spokane. I mean, their total membership attending and supporting was absolutely enormous. The previous year in Worldcon, of course, the warm body count was 7,000, and the registered attendance was, I think, close to 10,000. Then Helsinki happened, and they were expecting what, 5,500 to turn up, and was it 7,000 turned up, something like that? Nearly 8. Yeah, that was a bit of a surprise, not least to them and their convention center. San Jose, I think, was as expected, and then Dublin again. We were expecting a Glasgow-sized Worldcon, 4,500. I will show tracking curve for Dublin. It was tracking a bit below Worldcon until the beginning of this year, and then it was tracking same as Worldcon. So from an expectation of 4,500, we were worrying about 6,500 to 7,000 turning up. So that caused a lot of issues, especially in a convention center that could not expand. Next year we've got New Zealand. I don't know what your expected numbers are, about 2,000.
I don't think I'm speaking out of turn by saying something like that. Yeah.
Okay. And then we have the future after New Zealand. So we have Washington, D.C. One assumes that will be a normal-sized US Worldcon. It's in a fairly big catchment area, so that well may trend higher. That could be 6 or 7 or 8, or well, who knows? Yeah, and we're hearing that would be the first East Coast Worldcon for a long time, and that may affect the numbers as well. Then Chicago, which of course is also in a very large city with a large catchment area, and the last few Chi-Cons have been pretty large.
That said, though, US large catchment area still generally reliably produces 5,000 to 7,000 people. I mean, we haven't really wavered too much off that in those cities.
Yeah, I mean, you're just looking at Chi-Con's numbers. Chi-Con 7, that was in 2012, 4,700 warm bodies out of 6,200 members, although the economy was a bit dodgier then. So, and then of course, 2023. So let me just see, how should we actually make this a conversation?
So I'd like actually something out there about the European ones.
Okay, go for it.
Because what I'm mostly seeing with the European Worldcons at the moment is that the dramatic change that's occurred in Europe is you've got massive mobility and incredibly cheap airfares. What you were seeing with the earlier European Worldcons was that travel was difficult, it was expensive. Now you can get from most European countries to another one for about 30 euros if you're willing to take a stupidly early flight. And basically, Airbnb, a whole bunch of accommodation issues. There's almost a perfect storm going on in Europe at the moment, where every factor is aligning to ensure that you get everybody going. It's easy to attend. It's cheap to attend, relatively speaking, and the population is much more affluent than it has been before.
I'll add to that a possibility that comes to mind listening to what we've heard is that also while European Worldcons still happen every, say, 1 in 4 years, 1 in 5 years, that also means that more of a demand builds up between each European Worldcon and means possibly more people coming in.
But we don't see those same sorts of things in areas where that travel issue is difficult. Basically, the Australian Worldcons tracked pretty much with population growth. We still have expensive travel. We still have, vast distances to cover, and it's expensive when you get there. So we don't have quite those elements that drive those memberships higher.
It was interesting that for Dublin, certainly the travel part, I think I would agree, although Dublin's hotels are notoriously expensive, although there were many cheaper options, of course.
Yeah, as far as I can tell, more than half the attendees were not drawing from our list of hotels. Mostly pulling Airbnb or apartments or Trinity College or whatever else.
Yeah, I think that's true. And so again, if we think about upcoming Worldcons or bids outside of North America, we spoke about New Zealand. This is going to be the first one in New Zealand, as such, in Wellington. Most people who are traveling from outside New Zealand will be flying, I assume, into Auckland and then transferring. Many people will come for longer than the convention, so it'll be a destination, both North and South Island. What are your current plans, and what will you do if it's a lot more?
Well, this is a thing that we've been discussing on and off. And I think it's actually relevant for an awful lot of conventions overseas, regardless whether it's New Zealand, regardless whether it's Nice or anywhere else, is that we have to look at the possibility of capping, actually closing memberships at some point, because we've seen the problems that have been had when it's like, oh, just let them come in, it'll be fine, we'll cope. And the facility doesn't cope. And you've got queues and you've got massive strain on the number of people you can have in the room. Basically, you have to start looking at some point, if your numbers are going really, really well, at not looking at how many bums on seats you get and the dollars that'll bring in, but actually the quality of the experience that people are going to have at the convention. And if that means saying, look, our facilities can only cope with this many, then that's something you've got to take a good long hard look at and say, maybe it would be have a capped convention where people can get in and out of the rooms, they can get to what they want to actually attend, rather than saying, let's just take all their money and let it all work out in the end. Which I will put this forward that I don't say that that's what happened with the other conventions. I'm pretty sure that they thought they could actually make it work with their facilities. But as we know, in at least 2 cases, that hasn't been the case.
Yeah, in the case of Helsinki, of course, they were in a convention center where, with enough money thrown at it, an overnight edition of space could take place. In Dublin, for those of you that were there, the convention center is as big as it is. To add to that, and I'm afraid for people online, they won't see this, and I'm not connected up to the projector. I didn't know it would be moderating. Wrong one, sorry. The membership tracking curve for Dublin, which I'm going to show people in the room, and you're just going to have good eyesight. So this is the attending members of the red one is Dublin. And what it shows is, and you're welcome to come up and have a look at it. What it shows is for the first 12 months, so these are all compared, recent 10 Worldcons against the number of months pre-con. Okay, and for attending members, you see Dublin tracking significantly below London. And then sometime between a year ago and the beginning of this year, it jumped up. and it was tracking with London. So Dublin had the basis of a convention that was basically Glasgow-sized or a little bit bigger. And we were seeing then the potential of a London-sized attendance happening. And we then had to make the choice at the beginning of the, do we cap, which had never been done that early with the Worldcon and is very much against the culture, or do we get some additional space, find a way to make that attractive because the additional space is some distance away, and hope that that combination will be enough. And what happened, of course, in practice was the upper bound of the actual numbers turned up. We saw that from the tracking data. We did cap the membership about 3 or 4 weeks pre-con. But by then it was already a number which was at the upper bound of the convention center and of the other overflow place, and we had to then do lots of queuing and all of these kinds of things. So it was unfortunate.
It's always a challenge though with these sorts of trend lines. And, you know, New Zealand are going to face this much the same way that Australia did, which is that, you know, you can really only do a bunch of comparisons if you've got enough similarities between what's going on. If you've got short haul flights, if you've got, you know, a relatively affluent population within short things, you can basically deal with it. I'd be really interested to see what your breakdown was as to where those members were coming from. That I think is really the key part of it. If they're mostly European, then you know, I think that would bear out a lot of what I speculate is happening, and it's of less use then to Maree or any future Australian Worldcons, and probably not really significantly useful for Chengdu. But for Nice, it's very, very interesting.
Indeed. And we do have that data. I don't think I have it on my iPad at the moment, but absolutely. I mean, the Worldcon member statistics of names, but the statistics are kept and are shared and are analyzed. And so I would strongly recommend exactly what you've said, which is that future Worldcons, particularly European ones or non-North Americans, do look at that and understand the demographics.
I just want to say all kudos to Dublin for actually capping, because it hadn't been done before. And, you know, to be the first ones to do that counter to the culture, as he said, is extremely brave. And looking at, you know, the breakdowns now with the hindsight of 2020 vision, no pun intended, you know, would you have capped earlier had you known then what you know now?
I don't think we would have capped earlier. I think we would have potentially added more space to really, you know, the thing was, it's not the total number, it's the number of people at any one time that want to be in a certain place. And we did the best that we could to make the second venue as attractive as possible by moving art show and a number of other things to it. And with hindsight, that wasn't enough.
And there was, well, there were other aspects of that too. And that kind of touches into some of the other topics that we have in this panel, which is that the thing that was completely unexpected for Dublin was the way the convention centre operated. Dublin, more than any other facility, and I've been doing a lot of facilities work over the decades, more than anyone else was absolutely fascist about numbers. And more importantly, they were absolutely fascist about clearing the rooms, which basically meant that not only did you have all of the people trying to get into the room, you had all of the people getting out of the room, not just a portion of them, you know, which you would normally, but you had every single person leaving the venue.
Go ahead.
Just to speak to that question about would we have capped, I had that exact conversation with a bunch of people at Dublin.
Say your name.
Tammy Coxon. And it was a tough question, and I don't know what the right answer was. In the conversations I had with people, the consensus basically came down to, by not capping, it was a less good convention for the people who came than if we had capped. But was it better to offer a somewhat less good convention to more people than a really good convention to a smaller number of people. And I think people came down on the side of less good for more people, being able to include more people in the Worldcon umbrella. So that's where my conversations came down. But I think one of the things that I commented on a lot at Dublin is that the less goodness was not evenly distributed. So it was much less good for the staff and volunteers, was much less good for people with mobility concerns and access issues. So that load was not evenly distributed. It's a tough question. I don't have an answer, having lived through it.
It's also an interesting one too, though, where, and it comes down to one of the issues we have with Worldcon, where we don't use the facilities before. If there's no repeat experience, you're kind of coming into it assuming that the perceived wisdom still holds and that it will run the same way. Dublin was an interesting one where I think if there had been that historical knowledge of how that particular facility worked, I think we could have done an awful lot to remove the problems up front. And you could see it as things went on over the weekend that there were minor tweaks made to it to make the experience better. But going into it blind on a facility like that is a challenge all in its own.
I'll take a, and we don't want this to be all about Dublin. One, it's probably inevitable. Let me prioritize some of the questions. So there's some comments on the chat. The names are people who are involved in Dublin. The thing about this, we'd never been at that venue before, has certainly come up. The issue about the several hundred Irish fans joining in the last few months, which is very much the culture there. And of course, we did try to prioritize Irish fans. So we had to think about that as well. It was a tough call. I would also add, though, that again, it's even, as things often are, they're more nuanced. So Stephen's point is well made. However, we hadn't run a Worldcon there before, but the Dublin Comic Con, Irish Comic Con, had been held there for several years. And although
just to throw in about the Comic Con, though, we actually had people who work the Dublin Comic Con, and the issues that we were having were mostly about applying our usage patterns to the facility. Well, the Comic Con is much larger events that all flow out, and all of the start times are staggered.
Which was the point I was just about to make. But nevertheless, we did have some sense of the movement or the reaction of the convention center, and there were a large number of visits beforehand, to the point that the convention center itself was beginning to get a bit annoyed. But even then, I mean, if I talk about the two Glasgow Worldcons, the 95 and 2005, some things did change as well. In 2005, partly a result of the much stricter security that come in after 2001, they were also being very, very strict about people taking bags, for instance, or even carrying things into the meeting rooms. That was, in fact, the only thing to complain about in 2005. So sometimes you can't always predict. So with that build up, and then looking at our friends who are speaking for on behalf of Nice, which will, by definition, if it won, be a new first-time Worldcon in a convention center. I don't know to what degree of interest or horror you've listened to the stories so far, but do you have any observations or comments about the Nice bid?
Well, Bastein is very much the specialist of the Nice World Convention Center, so I'll let him answer.
No, I know that actually I'm learning a lot of things about the Worldcon and the history of Worldcon. So I understand that sometimes can happen a huge amount of people arriving and attending on the convention, but in France, it's like an habit to have at the end, in the last time of any events, a lot of people coming in the events. So that's why we always keep some space, some additional space, to be sure that we can host everyone in the convention. So Actually, it's difficult to know the future. We are just a bit, so but we know that in France, it's an habit that we can have.
Are you referring to events like the event in Nantes each year? That's further north, of course. The forget what it's called now. Anybody?
Nantes is the Utopial Festival.
Utopialis, that's it.
In Eastern France, you have the Imaginal Festival. Very different festivals, but both of them pretty big. 40,000, around 40,000 at Épinal. This year, they reached 100,000 in Nantes. And I think, I'm not entirely sure, but I think I heard that they now wanted to build a bigger convention center. But I think Bastein is mostly speaking in part of his own experience in terms of organizing events or being part of the milieu of event organization and having these kind of margins for last minute registrations.
So a question has come in, and I'm conscious that, of course, with 23, there are a number of bidders. So I want to give others the chance as well. But Esther has asked a question. So how is New Zealand dealing with queues?
In 2014, the government brought in the Health and Safety Act. And this it's an updated act to deal with a lot of things, health and safety in the workplace, health and safety during events. It changed the liability from what you were covered with by the venue to it all being on the person running the event. And, you know, having a health and safety officer on the board is something we've done. And that ties directly into how many people are in a room, how many people you can actually have standing around in a corridor in a queue. So basically, we'll be looking very carefully at exactly what, not exactly, saying what we can get away with is kind of the wrong phraseology here, but seeing exactly what options are open to us so that we can manage the flow of people around. Plus the fact that we have different venues. Around the place, they're all in very short walking distance. I can do it in my heels. So just putting that in. So yes, we're very conscious of this fact of the queues, but it also ties into the fact of what we are allowed to have health and safety wise. So it is being looked at as a thing. And yeah, we'll get back to you when we've done our homework.
Okay. So I asked that question to the people representing Nice. Of course, there are other bidders for 23, although they weren't. I can remember the panel. Of course, has some mix up here, and I don't want to put you in the spot from a Chengdu point of view. The panel after this one, of course, is focusing more on the experience of the you know, the people who visited from here, the two events in Beijing and then Chengdu in November. So if it's okay, there'll probably be more of an opportunity in that discussion to talk about, you know, facilities in Chengdu, unless you want to offer any observations at this stage based on the conversation that you've heard so far. Yeah, if you want, if you have the information, that would be great. Just on the grounds of balance as well.
We have the information in our documents, but not
Understood. Yeah.
You can jump up in the head. But we currently work for international expo, so it's a huge. Facilities can take huge numbers, and currently we are expecting total as well, maybe somewhere 10,000 close attendees. Yeah, both from China.
Based on existing Because you have an annual event in.
Yes, we have several different annual events
Interesting.
there. Yes.
And of course, Chengdu is an enormous city. It's what, 8 million or
and
more?
also we have we're putting many resources together from the government, cultural funding, corporate support. So there may be huge, publicity for this event that will draw much bigger attention.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for that. So,
I mean, it might also be worth moving on to some of the other interesting
issues. As the former moderator, perhaps you could
throw
in a couple of the other subjects.
The one I was mostly going to talk about was the facilities too, where at the moment, from an accommodation point of view, we're seeing some real big changes in the way that those are working for foreign Worldcons. We historically anyway have never had the large hotels that the US has access to, and that's pretty much in the last decade or so changed for a lot of those conventions as well. But what we haven't done is gone with the housing bureau type setup that most US conventions have done, and haven't bolted ourselves to those attrition clauses. And so, for instance, Dublin as a classic example, while there were agreements with individual facilities, there was no overarching housing bureau in, and more importantly, there was no attrition clause, which meant we had a lot of people booking outside the blocks.
Yeah, just wanted to say that New Zealand and certainly Australia doesn't have like the passkey system that you have in America, where a whole lot of hotels sort of are in one system that all can be booked as one. That is kind of anathema to New Zealand hotels who are like, what? No, we're not going to do that. So yes, overseas from America hotels, you generally find very independent as far as bookings concerned, and you have to have the individual contracts with them.
I was just going to slightly disagree with Stephen as well, because certainly in Glasgow and London, we did use a housing bureau, not to the same
American extent where
no, because attrition isn't a thing.
Yeah.
In those places, you book or you pre-book. There will be a date, but the risk is on the individual, not on the convention.
And that basically meant there was no requirement to go through it. So essentially for Dublin, all we were doing was providing a list of possible options, and there were others that you were free to pursue to your heart's content. Whereas a North American convention is usually generally bolted to a couple of large facilities, and we absolutely want you to use those because it will cost the convention an arm and a leg if you don't.
Yeah, we don't have attrition either, but then again, if you're doing something like running a fan table at a convention in America, you're going to want to be in the party hotel, or you're going to want to be in the hotel closest to the venue, for the simple reason to schlep those boxes across there's a pain in the ass if you have to do it from across town.
Yeah, especially if the parties aren't in a hotel. So a question from Esther: how would you make accommodation easier internationally? Is this possible?
It's a challenge. Essentially, the best we've been able to come up with is to essentially provide all of the options that we can find with all of the information that we think people need to know. Beyond that, different countries have made it very, very difficult for doing that. In Australia, we used a housing bureau. If we ever do it again, I think that would be the last time we did it, because things have moved on. Everything is online and easily accessible. And frankly, booking.com has a better way of, consolidating, or Trivago have a better way of consolidating leftover rooms to get cheaper rates than we can ever manage through a housing bureau anyway. And it doesn't incorporate Airbnb. So I think really all we can do is give as much information as possible, ensure that people are aware of where those facilities lie in relationship to each other, including hills and all of those fun things, and horizontal rain in Wellington. But you've got to give as much information as you can, but beyond that, there's very little we can do.
Yes, short of a certain former hotel owner buying up all the hotels and having them under one name around the world, yeah, you're just going to have to deal with it being messy.
I suspect it may be too early for our friends for 2023. Do you have any observations? I mean, on how the hotel situation would be handled?
Yeah, in France we have the chance, because it's really a chance that we have a tourism center that help a lot with the hotels possibilities and also. So we discussed a lot with them actually, and it's exactly the same thing. The main goal is to be sure that everyone have all the information needed to be to come in the country.
Let me offer a slightly wider question then to the panelists or to anyone. One of the things I thought was quite striking in both Helsinki and in Dublin was at least as far as I could see, the demographic breakdown by age of the people who were attending. And so, for instance, in Dublin, had these long lines, these long queues, but people, for the most part, particularly the younger ones, seem to be not only quite relaxed about that, but made the best of it. The Worldcon, this year is the 80th anniversary of the first Worldcon. Long term things change, they ebb and they flow, and sometimes, in particular now that the baby boomer demographic bulge is retiring out, and that probably covers quite a number of us, or almost. The expectations of what people will do or what they expect from a convention may change with that. And that would then, of course, affect with the kind of convention that we might run and the hotel situation, etc. Any observations around that?
Yes. As far as the young people not having a problem with queues, they are the ones that have been to the pop culture expos where they've stood 3 hours in a line to get, George Takei's autograph. So to them, going to San Diego Comic-Con where the crowds and queues are just part of the furniture. I mean, it's what you do. To them, having a queue to get into a session really isn't a major, but it kind of is if you want to go to that session and then go to the one afterwards. Because I think it's a case of managing expectations with people and trying to make sure that your numbers and what you can do with facilities match. You may not get it right every time, of course you won't. Naturally, nobody does. But I think putting in the effort for that is good, because we're not just lining up to get an autograph. We're actually trying to attend these sessions to talk about things that we want to talk about, and we don't want to miss half of it or all of it because you're in a queue. So yes, it's. I know that the younger generation don't mind standing in a queue, but I do.
And I'm not sure that it's that they don't mind it. I think that, one of the things that you get with San Diego Comic-Con is you have 150,000 people. The largest room they have takes 7,500 people. 150,000 people line up for something where they know that they've got like a 1 in 10 chance of getting in if they're lucky. So I think it really comes down to what is the sort of convention we want to run. And speaking for myself, my answer is not that.
Any other observations or in the room?
Hi, my name's Laurie Mann, and I was an information assistant for Dublin, and I'm a program assistant for New Zealand. And I have asked at SMOFCon that there be a panel that we're going to do tomorrow afternoon that basically is going to talk about line management, signing up for coffee classes, and issues of that nature. So if people would like to discuss this in a group,
put me down for that.
Yeah, well, feel free to come. It's tomorrow. I think it's at 1:30, but check the schedule.
I'll be there.
John Azels, the people who are at home can't recognise an Australian accent. So one of the things that's really changed over the time since I started going to my first Worldcon in 75 is that we can now virtualize the experience to a very large degree. Now, we're not, but here we have people connected via Zoom, and that's an experience. It might or might not be the best one, but it's certainly working. At what point do we say, all right, the culture of Worldcon is ready to start making virtualization and remote attendance part of what we do? The audience member said, long after I'm dead, and that can be arranged.
Yes. Okay, any comments?
My observation on what John's just said is that it fundamentally changes, obviously, the experience. You know, as you've admitted, it's an experience. It's not the experience we currently have. Kind of comes back to the large lines. You know, the personal interaction of a Worldcon is a big part of why I value it. So, you know, again, if somebody wants to run that sort of virtual convention, I think that would be a great experience for them to try and do. I just don't think it should be Worldcon.
I think the technology has become easier, but it's been there for already 2 decades or more. I remember experiments with this in the 90s. So if there hasn't been a massive movement to try and make this a reality, I think it does attest to the fact that the demand by the people coming is in part, maybe, as I said earlier, this kind of one, not quite in a lifetime, but, you know, in every few years, a chance to meet people, to discuss things with people all from all over the world. And so I'm just looking at it sociologically. Since the technology has been there for a while, and since there hasn't been a mass movement, I think that the people are voting in a sense.
Yeah, it's an interesting.
Just one observation I would make too is that I have a large team of people that work for me in Bangalore, in Chengdu, in Manila, in Singapore, Melbourne, and Sydney as well. And even then, you know, we have very, very, very expensive, very, very good video conferencing, all the rest of that, but we still attempt to get people together physically because that gives a much better interaction. You can build off that then later on. But if you don't know people, video conferencing is not the way to know them.
I think we also have to remember to divide this conversation mentally into like streaming the Hugos into another hall, because we can't fit everyone in the main hall, and actually streaming remote viewing off-site where somebody's sitting in their lounge but virtually attending the convention. That to me is 2 different things, and yeah, we have to keep that in mind.
I think you're probably right in the sense that there will be some elements of a Worldcon program which are more amenable to that. You know, like occasionally we'll do a focused literary program or something like that with papers in advance, which you might therefore find easier to have remote participation. Also understand about, you know, I also work for a big company with people in both India and the US, you know, so even arranging the convenient time for everybody to talk is difficult. Although the technology does continue to get better. I'm thinking about, you know, the Worldcon is 80 years old now. We are seeing demographic changes. We're also seeing changes in, you know, expectations that people have. We may well see, you know, at some point a very severe restriction on air travel, whether through direct policy or through taxation of carbon emissions or something, which may make it more difficult for people to travel internationally, although that may trigger a resurgence of local or regional conventions because travel is possible in other ways. So, you know, if you had to think further forward than say the current bidding horizon, let's say out to, you know, 2040 or 2050, you know, which do you think will happen first? So be a bit science fictional here. Is it going to be, you know, the virtualization will allow a more significant amount of interaction that way, or in fact it will go the opposite direction, or we'll muddle along?
Well, I do worry about the long-term future of such large international events requiring long-distance travel. because I do believe in the climate emergency. Will that lead to a complete Worldcon in Second Life, with all of us being avatars and connecting virtually? Maybe not, maybe so. As a writer, I might have fun with that.
Give your name first, okay?
Tom Becker, and I have two observations from my experience with Worldcons outside North America. One really brilliant thing that Helsinki did was getting transit passes for all the members. And so that took something that could have been a huge problem and with basically having the hotels being far away from the convention center, but it worked. The other thing about the Dublin Worldcon that really struck me was the incredibly high intellectual level of the Irish program participants. And they're just assumed that the discussion would be at a very high level. It was very interesting. I learned a lot more because of that. And so even though I wasn't able to make it to a lot of programs, it was really worth it when I did.
Thank you. Go on.
Hello, my name is Kent Bloom, and I wanted to go back just to the last discussion about venue sizes and hall sizes, and particularly the main event halls. There is a major, I guess you'd call it a feedback effect, when you get everybody together in one place and you show them the same thing. When you divide that into 2 or 3 places, you still maintain a fair amount if you get a critical mass. But when you distribute it very widely, when you can't include more than 50% or 60% of your total membership in the Hugo or Masquerade or whatever major events, it changes the nature of the convention, and it really deprecates the effect of having these major activities. I'm very concerned, and it's not just international conventions, the ones in the United States, where we're having them in places where the arenas or theaters or whatever we're using are not big enough for the event, so that everybody who wants to attend can't attend, and people will go away disappointed because of the lack of space. In addition to which, of course, Dublin was anathema because they actually used tickets. Well, they called them wristbands, but we don't need no stinking tickets was the motto of Worldcon for at least the 35 years or so that I've been doing it. We worked very hard not to give tickets, and I can only remember about 2 or maybe 3 other conventions where we did them. We definitely need to consider if we're going to somewhere outside where we've been before, whether or not we have enough facility to actually hold a masquerade.
And on that particular case, I would point to Stephen's earlier comment, because that was an imposition of the convention center at the last minute, not something we chose to do. Go ahead. We're almost out of time, so we have to wind down. Go ahead.
I'm here, Tony Xia from Chengdu, China again. Speaking of technology, as personal thinking, my observation is for the future couple of years. I think it's possible we adopt more advanced technologies in China, as 5G technology being like commercialized, and even VR, like live streaming services could be provided. And I'm thinking personally, we could do some special programs for some specific like panel or events to better tailor to the fans and or to the events. So that's possible, and it will be put into our consideration to the proposal for the bidding and also for the community.
Okay, yeah, thank you. We're going to have to wind down. I'm just going to acknowledge the people on the line who have given us feedback as well. It was useful for people to give their names, so that is a good thing. Of course, the panelists should probably have done the same as well. So I'll remember that as well. And then various comments on the interaction of people at events versus a remote experience. However, we've been given the signal, so I'd like to thank the panelists and the participation of the people in the room and online. So let's see what actually happens. Thank you.